The transfer went through. The recipient was not careless. They checked the email. It looked right. The name, the formatting, the signature, the urgency that matched the kind of request Sarah did sometimes send. What they did not check, because nobody does on the 100th email of the day, was the domain. One character difference, a hyphen that wasn't supposed to be there. A domain registered the previous week specifically for this purpose. But I want to be careful here, because that story makes impersonation sound like a social engineering problem, a human problem, a training problem, something you fix with better awareness campaigns. It is not only that. Impersonation is an identity problem, and it happens at every layer of a system, not just in email inboxes, but inside APIs, between services, inside authentication flows, inside the trust relationships between components that never involve a human at any point. The email example is the one people recognize. The technical versions are the ones that do the most damage. In this video, we are going to look at what impersonation actually is at a structural level, why systems are vulnerable to it, what attackers are exploiting when they use it, and what the defense looks like when it actually works. Impersonation, at its simplest, is when a system accepts a false identity claim as genuine. That sounds obvious, but the reason it keeps working, across decades of security investment, is that every verification system is making the same fundamental trade. It cannot verify the subject directly. It can only verify the artifacts the subject presents. And if an attacker can produce the right artifact, or can get the system to accept something close enough, the verification succeeds for the wrong person. This is a different class of attack from the bypass techniques we covered last time. In the previous video, the attacker obtained a legitimate artifact from the legitimate user. They relayed a real MFA code. They stole a real session token. In impersonation, the attacker constructs or presents their own artifact and gets the system to treat it as belonging to a different identity. The distinction matters because the defenses are different. Stopping artifact theft requires protecting the channel and the endpoint. Stopping impersonation requires the system to be able to distinguish between a genuine artifact and one that has been constructed or substituted, which is a harder problem, and one where the failure modes are less obvious. Impersonation attacks fall into three categories depending on where in the identity chain the substitution happens, and each one exploits a different assumption that systems make about the identities they are dealing with. The first category is identity spoofing, constructing an artifact that looks like it belongs to a target identity without actually compromising that identity. The email example at the start is the human-facing version. The attacker did not need access to Sarah Chen's actual email account. They just needed to construct something that looked enough like Sarah Chen to pass the informal check the recipient would apply. At the system level, the equivalent is domain spoofing, sender ID forgery, and certificate misissuance. DNS allows any server to claim any hostname unless the receiving system is configured to verify that claim cryptographically. Email protocols allow any server to claim any sender address unless the receiving server is configured to check DMARC, DKIM, and SPF records. And even then, the checks can be bypassed if those records are misconfigured or the receiving server is lenient about enforcement. The structural property being exploited in all of these cases is the same. The identifier and the credential are not tightly bound. A name, a domain, an email address is just a string. The system accepts the string as identifying the subject, without always verifying that the entity presenting the string is the one that controls it. TLS certificate verification was designed specifically to close this gap for web traffic. A certificate authority vouches that a specific public key is controlled by the entity claiming a specific domain. This works well when the CA infrastructure is healthy. It fails when CAs are compromised, when certificates are misissued, or when systems are configured to skip validation in environments where it is considered inconvenient. The frequency with which TLS validation is disabled in internal systems, test environments, and service-to-service communication, often permanently, because it was disabled during development and never re-enabled, is one of the most consistent contributors to impersonation risk in real infrastructure. The second category is credential substitution, presenting a genuine credential, but one that belongs to a different identity than the one being claimed. This sounds paradoxical at first. How do you present a genuine credential for an identity you are impersonating? The answer is that identity systems often check the credential separately from checking whether the credential matches the specific identity being claimed. If those two checks are not tightly coupled, if the system verifies that a credential is valid without also verifying that the credential belongs to this specific identity in this specific context, an attacker can present a genuine credential for one identity while claiming to be a different one. This happens in federated systems where assertion validation is incomplete. A service provider that verifies the signature on a SAML assertion without also verifying that the assertion was issued for itself, rather than for some other service in the same federation, can be tricked into accepting an assertion that was legitimately issued to a different service. The credential is real. The issuer is real. The signature is valid. But the intended recipient is not the service that just accepted it. It also happens in API authentication, when tokens carry insufficient binding to the caller. A token issued for service A that does not cryptographically bind itself to service A's specific key can be presented by service B if service B obtains it, and the receiving API may only check that the token is valid, not that it was issued for the caller presenting it. The pattern is consistent. The verification system checks the artifact, but the artifact does not carry enough information to definitively bind it to both its origin and its intended recipient. The third category is the most architecturally interesting and the hardest to defend against without changing how systems are designed. Many systems extend implicit trust to other components based on their position in the network or their role in the architecture. A service running in the internal network is assumed to be internal. A request arriving on an internal port is assumed to come from an authorized caller. A component that has already authenticated once is assumed to have earned ongoing trust for subsequent requests without re-verification. An attacker who can position themselves within that trusted context by compromising one internal component, by exploiting a server-side request forgery vulnerability that makes requests appear to originate internally, by pivoting from a perimeter breach into a network segment that receives implicit trust, inherits the trust assumptions that come with the position. They are not claiming to be a specific person. They are not presenting a forged credential. They are exploiting the fact that the system does not ask who is making this request because it assumes that the question has already been answered by context. This is sometimes called confused deputy impersonation. The attacker convinces a trusted component to make requests on their behalf, using the trusted component's authority rather than establishing any identity of their own. The trusted component is not compromised. It is doing exactly what it is designed to do. The problem is that it cannot distinguish between a legitimate request from its intended caller and a manipulated request from an attacker who found a way to influence its inputs. The detection problem with impersonation is more fundamental than with most attacks because successful impersonation does not leave a trace of failure. When an attacker brute forces a password, there are failed authentication attempts before the success. When malware exfiltrates data, there is anomalous outbound traffic. When someone tries to access a resource they are not authorized for, there is an access denied event in the log. When impersonation works, none of those signals exist. The authentication succeeded. The identity was accepted. The access was within the permissions of the impersonated identity. Every log entry shows a normal, successful interaction. The system did exactly what it was supposed to do for what it believed was the right entity. Detection of impersonation, therefore, cannot rely on failure signals. It has to rely on consistency signals. Does the behavior of this identity match what we would expect from this identity? Is it accessing resources at expected times, from expected locations, in expected volumes, in expected patterns? Anomaly detection rather than rule-based detection, which means it is probabilistic, context-dependent, and produces false positives, all of which make it harder to operationalize than a rule that fires when a specific event occurs. The defenses against impersonation converge on a single principle. The tighter the binding between an artifact and its intended subject and context, the harder impersonation becomes. Mutual TLS requires both ends of a connection to present certificates, not just the server proving its identity to the client, but the client proving its identity to the server. The connection cannot proceed unless both parties are who they claim to be, and both claims are cryptographically verified. It is more operationally complex than one-way TLS. That complexity is the cost of closing the spoofing gap for service-to-service communication. Audience validation in tokens. The check that a token was issued specifically for the service now receiving it closes the credential substitution gap in federated systems. It adds one field check to the assertion validation logic. That one check is the difference between a token that can be replayed across services and one that is bound to a specific intended recipient. And eliminating implicit network trust, treating every request as unauthenticated until it proves otherwise, regardless of where it originates, closes the trust relationship exploitation gap. This is the core architectural principle of zero trust, and it is disruptive to implement because it requires every service-to-service interaction to carry explicit proof of identity rather than relying on network position as a proxy. Each of these defenses solves a different variant of impersonation. None of them solves all three, and all of them add operational complexity that organizations consistently underestimate until they are dealing with the breach that the missing control would have prevented. Impersonation works because verification systems check artifacts, not subjects. An attacker who can produce the right artifact or get the system to accept something close enough does not need to compromise anyone's actual credentials. The email story at the start was the simple version. The same logic runs through API authentication, federated trust, and service-to-service communication. Anywhere a system accepts a claim about identity without sufficiently binding that claim to the specific entity making it, in the specific context it is being made.